lot of people think that if they write a book and it gets rejected, it was a waste of time. It's frustrating, it's disappointing, but it isn't actually a waste of time.
Have you been wondering whether to self-publish or to seek traditional publishing for your book? My guest today is Stephen Aryan. He has been traditionally published since 2015 with Orbit Books, but for his latest book, New York Minute, he's decided to go the self-publishing route.
It's a weird book because one, it's a novella, two, it crosses a lot of genre borders, and it's not my usual sort of thing, so traditionally publishing it is quite difficult, especially because of the length.
Stephen chats with me about his upcoming book and why he feels that it doesn't fit into the traditionally published sphere.
The headline is that it's a crime story set in an alternate New York City. Some people have described it as kind of gaslamp gangs of New York.
We also take a deeper look at today's publishing landscape and some of the pros, cons, and myths about TradPub.
Some of them come from companies trying to push people into self-publishing, but they charge them for it as a service, and so they spread lies.
Whether you've been wondering which publishing path to take, or you've ever wanted a perspective from someone who has taken both paths, this is a conversation you're not going to want to miss.
The fact that you started a book and you finished a book means you're ahead of 98% of the people that say they're going to do that.
What does it take to become a successful science fiction or fantasy writer? You're listening to the greatest podcast in the multiverse, the show that aims to provide you with writing tips, tricks, and inspiration for your author career by chatting with other successful science fiction and fantasy authors. I am your host, Herman Stuarnagel. I'm an author who is eager to learn more. I hope you'll join me in these conversations to learn and grow in your own writing, and maybe to find a new favorite book or author along the way. Ready to explore? Because on this show, every conversation is a doorway into a different world. Welcome once again to the greatest podcast in the multiverse. I'm very lucky to have Stephen Aryan with me today. Welcome here, Stephen.
Thank you for having me. Nice to be here.
Yeah, you're so welcome. I'm glad you can join me. So Stephen, usually I let the guests kick us off a little bit and just give us a little bit of background of who you are and a bit about your writing journey.
Yeah, sure. So I've been writing stories for as long as I can remember. When I was looking to be published, this is going back quite a while ago now, traditional publishing was the only viable path at the time.
Right.
So I did the thing that was required at the time. I wrote a book, I edited it, I did it over and over, got friends to read it many times until I thought it was good enough and revised it and edited it. And then I started sending it out to agents.
Right.
And I finished my first book when I was 19.
Oh, wow.
And I was convinced, of course, it was fantasy because I grew up reading fantasy and loving fantasy. And I knew that this was a brilliant book. So I wrote the sequel because, it's never just going to be one-off standalone.
Of course.
At the time then, it's always series of books, trilogies
That's
or
right.
more. So I started writing the sequel whilst sending out the first book on submission, which was rejected by every agent that handled fantasy because it was awful. So then I had a book that was rejected and a sequel that I finished when I was 21 that no one would ever read because it was in the same series as the other one.
Yeah, right.
So that was the start of my journey. And then I spent many years after that writing more books, going to events, listening to authors and agents and editors and publishers talk about the business, learning about traditional publishing. Right. And I just kept writing books, working on them, sending them out, getting rejected, taking a break, trying something different, and just kept doing that for years and years and years until something finally clicked.
Yeah, right. Wow. So how many books do you, or do you even know how many books did you write in between before you had that first book picked up by the publisher?
8, maybe.
8 books.
Maybe 8 novels. I experimented a bit. I tried different genres. I tried kind of a different writing approach. I did at one point a collection of like short stories. I was thinking, is it just the skill or is it the content? Is it that the market isn't right? Is it that I'm just not writing to my strengths? So I did try and play around. I plan my books, but I was thinking, right, maybe that's it. Maybe it's just, need to be a bit more loose and free.
Right.
So I completely pantsed a book and it was terrible. I don't think I even sent that one out to agents. I was like, this can't be salvaged. I thought, maybe I can salvage it, and I couldn't.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, about 8 or 9 books, I think. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I think, it's always, you always look at authors, whether traditional or self-published, and you look at them, and, when they have some success, you look at it and you think, wow, like why can't my book take off like that? And often we don't see, the backstory of the 8 to 10 books. So I think even, Brandon Sanderson, I think, had written like 12 books before that just
Yes.
got picked up, something like
Yep.
that, right? So, it takes time, and that's something that, people don't often see or want to think about. They think that first book is going to be the one to take off, right?
They think it is good. They think it is brilliant. They think the quality is good enough. And at the time, I thought that it was the best book that I could write when I was 19. But
Right.
it really wasn't good enough quality. I hadn't really lived my life much at all. I hadn't really seen or been or done anything apart from being at school. So, it was pure imagination, and it just wasn't good enough. But a lot of people, as you said, they don't want to hear that. They think,
Right.
well, it's brilliant. With hindsight, I know that it wasn't. But
yeah, right. Yeah, but at the time, it's, especially when you invest, probably a year or more into your first book, especially because I think most authors take that at least a year to put that first book together. You don't want to hear that you wasted that year, and it's not really a waste, but at the time, I'm sure it felt that way.
It
when you
feels that way.
Yeah,
this is the thing I kind of came to terms with eventually. A lot of people think that if they write a book and it gets rejected, it was a waste of time. It's frustrating, it's disappointing, but it isn't actually a waste of time. I've come to realize with over the years, because many people say, oh, I'm going to write a book one day, and they never do. The fact that you started a book and you finished a book means you're ahead of 98% of the people that say they're going to do that. The fact that you then sent it out and you did, got rejected like I did on my first one. A lot of people don't do that either. They're not willing to have the courage to say, I think it's good enough, I'll have a go, because they're too frightened. Because they think, oh, no, I know it's good. I don't need to have someone else prove that to me. And I'm like, well, then why are you afraid of it? Anyway, so there's so many things, but finishing a book, you learn a lot from doing the process of it. You learn about yourself, you learn about characters and story and world building and everything. And you can only begin to work on a book when it's finished and then look back at it as a whole. And a lot of people fall into that trap of saying they get 50,000 words in. Oh, no, I'll just go back and fix the beginning. I'm like, that's not a good idea. And I've heard so many stories about like that over the years. People say, oh, I needed to make it perfect. I'm thinking that's not possible. And also, if a book is picked up by anybody, whether it's, traditionally published by an agent and then a publisher, or you self-publish it, it's going to go through a number of other hands and a number of edits. Yeah. So that finished draft, even if it's your 5th draft, it's not going to be perfect. It won't be. It can't be yet, because it needs more work and attention.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I keep hearing the advice that the best way to find the stubborn typos in your book is to hit publish, and you'll assuredly find a few typos the next day.
Oh yeah. Someone's like, has anybody proofread this book? Like, yes, lots, but we're all human and we all missed it. Like, eventually you're just staring at it and you can't see the words on the page anymore because you've read it 30 times. So you're going to see what you think is there as opposed to what is actually there.
100%. Yeah, it's it's amazing how much information our brain fills in while we're reading, especially if it's familiar with the text already.
Yes.
So it's going to miss things on those 5th and 6th and 7th passes. It still misses those typos, and it's unbelievable to me.
Yeah, it's so frustrating.
It really is. It is. And another thing to that point though too is like I've heard the advice, and I forget who said it. Maybe it was Brandon Sanderson. That you need to write 1 million bad words. You need to get those 1 million bad words out, kind of before you kind of hit your stride and figure out the process of writing. Like, do you disagree with that?
Maybe. So there's 2 things. There's Malcolm Gladwell, who's said you have to do 10,000 hours of anything before you get good at it. And people are saying, oh, well, that isn't what he was actually saying. People have paraphrased it and shortened it. What he was saying is, if you put 10,000 hours into anything, you'll obviously get a lot better than someone who comes in cold.
Right.
And I think that's true of writing. Like, you don't have to measure up to, now I've done 10,000 hours and one, now I'm brilliant. It doesn't work that way. Equally, the 1 million words, I don't think that's accurate too. I think all it means is, when you boil it down, you have to dedicate yourself to this thing, whatever this pursuit is you're going. Like the Olympics have just been on. They don't do 10,000 hours of practice and then go, right, that's it, I'm getting a gold medal now.
Yeah,
It
that's it.
doesn't.
Did it.
I've
Nailed
done
it.
it. Gold medal. What do you mean I didn't get a gold medal? What do you mean I didn't qualify? It's that thing of you have to put the time and the effort in, potentially for no reward, potentially for no progress, because you love the thing that you're doing. Like some people saying,
Yeah.
I've heard some people say, "Oh, I like having written, but I don't like writing. I like, once it's done." I'm thinking, then you shouldn't be a writer. Like why would you want to write if you don't like it? Go and try and get the Olympics. Go and play golf. Go and do something you actually like to do. Because if your first book is a great success, any path that you take, the people and the fans and the readers are going to go, well, where's the next one? If like, well, I don't like writing, I'm not going to do another one. Why would I write it?
Yeah,
So
yeah. I feel like some of that is a bit tongue in cheek though when people say that to you, because I mean I'm probably guilty of saying that as well, because it's not that I don't enjoy writing, because I do, but when
yeah,
you're in the grind, some days it's like, oh, I just, you're happy when it's done, and you're like, I mean, I look at my finished product and I'm like, I can't actually believe that I wrote this. This is incredible at times, but in the moment when you're trying to figure out which scene goes where and how things fit, it's sometimes a bit more of a grind. So I I do feel
it's
like I know what they're saying, but I understand your point too.
yeah, it's like people say, if you love your job, you'll never work a day in your life. That isn't true either, because I
Yeah.
love writing, and if it was my full-time job every day, like any job, there are some days, like you said, you sit down and you're like, oh, I'm just tired, and the kids are playing up, I didn't get enough sleep, and I'm distracted, and you got all these things in your mind, but you have to get the words done, so you get the words done. And then the next day you've slept well and you're energizing, brilliant, and you double the word count from the previous day. So it's
Totally.
not that you'll never work. It is still work, but I think it's that thing of, you need to enjoy what you do and keep, whether it's 1,000,000 words or 10,000 hours or however many it is, like me, many books and many thousands of hours to get to that point where the quality of the work was good enough that it could
Hmm.
go somewhere. And I felt
For
happy
sure.
with it. And other people reading externally felt happy with it. So
For
I
sure.
think setting a limit on it and like a ceiling and then saying beyond that, everything is gravy. I think that's kind of a little bit distracting.
That's fair. Yeah, that's a fair point. And I feel like maybe I didn't haven't considered that people might take it take it to mean that. When I mean I mean, to me at least, I don't think I've ever considered that's the cap. And then you're
Yeah.
good after that. But for me, what I take a look at my earlier my earlier books that I did write, and like you said, for your first couple of books, and I think, yeah,
Mm.
I thought I knew what I was doing back then. But I've
Yes.
learned a lot, and you learn a lot through that process of writing, and just through experiencing, and then having readers read it and tell you, certain things weren't maybe the best um, in this work.
Yeah.
That,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah.
Um, but that segues nicely into the next question, and that
Mm.
it talks about the why about writing. So, what's your personal motivation for writing? Why did you continue through those 8 books that got rejected to try to get published and to make this happen for yourself?
I just love stories. Whatever medium it is, whether it's, I love TV and film and comics and games. More recently, in the last 20 years, games, the storytelling's been just fantastic. And
Yeah.
I just love good story, and nothing annoys me more than bad story. There are some TV shows on now, very, very expensive TV shows on the television, and I sit there and I'm just like, yeah, it looks good, but the story's awful, and it really annoys me. But
Yeah.
I just love telling stories. I've loved stories since I was a little kid.
Nice.
Started with fantasy, and it never went away. I love the pure imagination of storytelling, that I can go anywhere and do anything, and then having the opportunity to craft my own universe whole cloth just from things in my brain swirling around. I mean, there's no better feeling for me than writing a story and feeling satisfied with it, looking back and thinking, that's really good. I really like that. It brings me enormous pleasure. Never mind anybody else who reads it. I just love the process of creation and building
Yeah.
these worlds and characters up from the ground up. It's just a satisfying thing that I'm never going to stop doing.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and that's great. And especially to kind of to know that's your motivation, so that whether or not people are reading it, you're enjoying the process, you're enjoying, the
Yeah,
storytelling and that sort of thing, right? So when
yeah,
did
you've got
that,
to.
is there a moment or a story or something that I guess started that ball rolling for you back when you were a kid, that started your love of storytelling? Even if whether that's fantasy or story in general?
Definitely fantasy. So even from a young age, it would have been The Hobbit and Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, all of the C.S. Lewis books to begin with, and then it just stayed with fantasy. I think my parents were slightly worried because I was only reading fantasy, but after a while they realized, well, he's always reading. Like ever since I've been, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old, I've always had a book on the go. I've never not been reading a book. So if I'm out somewhere and I've got 40 minutes, I'll take the book out of my pocket and just sit and start reading for, in a break between things. Or I've just, so it started with a lot of the kind of fantasy series like Dragonlance, Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, and Ursula Le Guin and Terry Brooks. All of these kind of really formative, David Eddings, all these ones that really important, formative my early years. And then as I grew up, I progressed to more mature fantasy and then looked at other genres once I got to my kind of teenage years. But for the first like 15 years, it was fantasy, it was world mythology. And I just kind of worked my way through the school library and then my town library for all the sections. Everything that I could read, basically.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I found, at least when I was growing up, there definitely wasn't the breadth of fantasy that there is now. There, I mean, I grew up in a small town too, so I was really limited in the fantasy that I had access to. So, I kind of read the bit. Terry Brooks was a big influence for me as well. But some of those other ones, it was a bit harder to find.
So I was thinking about this the other day. Like someone said to me, "Why Terry Brooks?" And I'm thinking when I started reading, the sort of Shannara and the Wish Song and things had already come out. But I remember the Scions of Shannara was coming out, and it was the first one that was like a new Shannara. And when people talk about things like, this is my Batman, this is my Superman, something, that was my Shannara book because we knew that it was coming in like a year. And I'm thinking, oh, brilliant. And that was my kind of, I'd gone back and read the previous one, but then that point forward, the next like 8 books or whatever were my generation of Shannara books. And I loved having that. I also love his Running with the Demons, the Word in the Void trilogy.
Yeah, those were
They're
good.
so underrated.
They're
so, it's like Stephen King. Whenever he says he used to go to do like bookshop talks and stuff, and say to everyone, who's read it, who's read The Shining, everyone puts their hand up. And he's like, who's read The Dark Tower? And like 4 people put their hand up. I kind of feel like that with Terry Brooks. Like he's like, who's read Shannara? And everyone puts their hand up. And like, who's read The Word in the Void? And like 2 people at the back.
Right. Yeah.
And I love those books.
Yeah,
they're so
I absolutely
good.
Love them too. Yeah,
they're
I remember
so
when that
as well.
They are, and when I read those when they first came out, because I was still in high school when those came out. But and then he connected this series. I mean, spoilers for anyone who hasn't read the entire Shannara series.
I haven't, but I know that he has connected them.
He's connected them to the world. So I think I've read, other than the latest one, that because he's still writing them, which is wild to me. But
guy's in his like 70s now, early 80s even. He's just like still going. Wow.
Yeah, he's still going, I mean, so anyone who hasn't read the 21 books, it's a great place to start because it does end up being the start of kind of the entire story, the way he connected it. So, yeah. But I agree, highly underrated books for sure. So, let's talk about your books a little bit now.
Sure.
You approached me because you've written a new book. You've done things a little bit differently with it. So the title of it's called New York Minute. Can you tell us a little bit about this book?
Yeah, so it's a novella, which is different for me. People say, "Oh, did you start out in short stories?" Nope, I started out in novels, and I never went down to anything else. I've written 4 short stories in my life. I think I just struggled with the form. I don't know why. I've spoken to people about it and like, try this, try that. Never kind of got around to doing it. So I was on contract for my traditionally published novels, and I had a bit of time in between edits, and I had an idea in the back of my head that had been bugging me for ages, and I'd made loads of notes and written it down and left it alone because I was busy. But then I had a bit of time, and I thought, right, now I've got a bit of time, I'm going to write this story. I'm just going to not worry about the genre or the length. I'm just going to write it out and see what happens. And so I wrote this story. And then I put it on a shelf and left it for a while because I went back to editing the next book. And then it wouldn't kind of leave me alone. And so I kept revisiting it and tweaking it. And then I decided, right, it's a weird book because 1, it's a novella. 2, it crosses a lot of genre borders. And it's not my usual sort of thing. So traditionally publishing it is quite difficult, especially because of the length. Right. And so I decided to self-publish it. And I've been working with an editor, and then a proofreader, and a cover designer, and someone to help me on the interior layouts and all this kind of stuff. And now I've done the whole thing myself, as opposed to working with a publisher. I am the publisher this time, so
right,
it's been
yeah,
very new and different process.
yeah, yeah. And I'm curious about that. So you made the decision. You didn't try to option it at all. You just
No,
decided that you were going to self-publish it, and that was just based on the kind of the genre and the length of it. Those are kind of the two criteria. Um,
yeah,
so now you've been all your other books are traditionally published. What was that
yes.
process like for you, moving into self-publishing?
So I've been talking to a lot of authors over the last few years. I started during a YouTube channel during COVID because we couldn't do events, and I wanted to talk to authors, and I miss doing
Yeah.
that. So I've been interviewing authors for 4 years now, just to because I quite enjoy it. And
Hmm.
part of that, I would talk to self-published authors. I have some friends who are self-published authors, like Ben Galley and Rob J. Hayes and Brian Carhill and people.
Nice.
And so I started gathering information about it, and they kept saying to me, "Oh, you should have a go at some point." I'm like, yeah, "I'd like to, but I'm kind of on contract for novels, and it's
Hmm.
quite difficult." And so I started just talking to them and other people about how I would go about it. Who would I call on? Who could I ask to edit my books? Who would you recommend? And so it was me just doing a lot of kind of background research and finding out
Right.
how to navigate through this process for myself, the kind of the limits, and that in some cases there were no limits compared to traditional publishing, and especially in terms of timing. That's the biggest difference, I would say, and the fact that
Hmm.
I'm the publisher, so I make decisions on everything. So
Yeah, so was there anything that surprised you going through that process that you weren't expecting, based on your previous works?
the amount of work it took on interior layout, I think
Oh,
that
really?
was one of the biggest surprises. The number of I think it's ready, and I look at it and I get it all set up on ebook, and I look at it, I think that's still not right, and a lot of revisions on that thing, kind of
Hmm.
interior structure. The process had quite a lot of steps, and I had Michael R. Fletcher helping me with that. So, and he was like, right, now do this step, now do this step. And there was a lot of different steps to go through. So that
Right.
was quite fiddly, a lot of kind of finessing and tweaking things and then checking it. And so, yeah, that took a lot of work. But I knew that because I'd not done this before, I need a lot of time up ahead. So I gave myself a longer lead time so that I wouldn't
Okay.
be racing to publication date to get it out.
Right. So, what was the time frame from when you finished writing and drafting and thought, this is good enough to send to the editor, to when, I mean, it comes out, when's the release date of the
October
book?
1st.
October 1st. So,
Mm.
it'll be out in a couple of weeks. So what's kind of the time frame that took you from start to finish?
So I wrote it I'd written it last year, and it was at the beginning of this year that I started reaching out to people and sort of saying,
Okay.
right, thinking, right, 10 months, that's plenty of time if I'm in control of it a bit more. It's been done 4 months because I knew I didn't want to, like I said, I didn't be like, I was still working on it and it's coming out in 2 weeks. I hate
Yeah.
rushing. So I approached people in kind of January, February, March time of this year and started the ball rolling, getting an editor, talking to the cover designer, and just kind of thinking, right, how long would it take you? And they say, oh, a couple of weeks or something. Like, oh, wow, okay.
Yeah,
I'd give myself at least a month for some of these things, and it was
for
always
sure.
shorter. The longest things were me doing the work behind the scenes, like the layout or coordinating all the different pieces.
Hmm.
And I knew that would eat up a lot of time. So I just gave myself 10 months to sort it, which I
Okay.
think I could have done it a lot shorter, but I was
Yeah.
just being cautious because it's my first time doing it.
For sure. And I think, it's always better, I feel, to err on the side of, having too much time than not enough, right? Because like you said,
Yeah.
you don't want to be rushing to get it out the door. I've done that. That's absolutely not fun at all. I don't recommend it.
Yeah.
And, the sooner you have it done too, the sooner you can get some of those ARC reviews out as well. Because
Yes.
I did notice that you have, quite a number of, fairly good art, advanced reviews out already on the book. So, having it done sooner, you're able to get it out and get people reading and reviewing it earlier as well.
Yeah. I sent it to a bunch of friends who were authors to see if they'd read it and give me cover quotes, and they did, fairly quickly because it's not too long either. It's not as big a commitment. So they're like, yeah,
That's
sure,
right.
sure. So I've had a bunch of people do reviews, and there's early reviews on Goodreads already, but there's more kind of lined up now because I've been planning all of this for months. So
Definitely. Yeah, and like you said, it's a pretty quick read. Yeah, I guess while we're on that topic, we'll switch back and forth a little bit here. But tell us a little bit about the story and what the story is about.
Yeah, so it's a weird cross genre book. I keep describing it. So the kind of the headline is that it's a crime story set in an alternate New York City. Um, some people have described it as kind of gas lamps, gangs of New York, or something like that. But
Yeah,
I've shied away from the word fantasy because it isn't really. There's no monsters, there's no magic, there's no dragons or anything like that. It's very much speculative fiction, but it's a strong crime story with a noir bent, really. It's about a guy in this other New York City who used to be a cop and is now a PI. And so it falls into certain of those kind of tropes. He's hired for a case, he's kind of in over his head. He starts investigating it with his best friend, and they go into the underbelly of New York City. And the technology level is not modern day. This is why I say it's an alternate New York City.
yeah,
It's a different New York. The reasons why become very apparent in the first kind of chapter. You understand where they are and why the technology is at the level that it is. But really, it's not about the place they are or the city of stuff. It's about people. It's about humanity. It's about if we're stripped away of so many things and we're given a new start in a new New York, what would we do different? Would everything be the same? Who are we as a people when the past is kind of erased and we're given a second chance? So it's about the best and the worst of humanity and navigating that through the criminal underworld of this city.
yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I totally agree because I did end up reading or I have read the book. The background is definitely, the story is about the people, it's about the characters, and it's about what's their motivations are and what's driving them, and the background is the background, and it's kind of the set. It acts kind of as a setting, but I mean, obviously, it's kind of pivotable. Why
Pivotal.
can't I say it? Pivotal?
Pivotal.
That's the word. Like that's not right. Okay, pivotal to what's happening. Yeah.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So, I'm interested though, you said this was kind of the idea that left you alone. What about this idea was kind of nagging at you for the last couple of years that you had to put it down and, really start a new publishing path in order to get it out there? Like what about it was nagging at you?
So as well as growing up with fantasy, I've loved crime and cop shows since I
Hmm.
was a little kid, like all the way back to like T.J. Hooker back in the day.
Okay.
All the way through to like NYPD Blue and Homicide: Life on the Street and more modern things like The Wire and Law and Order. And there's all the
Yeah.
British cop shows that I grew up watching. So I've been that's kind of been in the background of my life, for the last 40 plus years. And I love crime stories. I don't really love crime fiction, but I watch more crime stuff. Like right before this episode we were recording, I was just watching the series one of Bosch Legacy, the
Oh,
Michael
okay.
Connelly series. I love
Yeah.
Bosch, and so I always wanted to write crime in some ways. My second novel, Blood Mage, has quite a strong crime bent to it,
Yeah.
and
Right.
it scratched the itch for a while. But I think this was kind of the result of I wanted to do some more crime stories, but I didn't want to just do a straight crime novel in the 21st century. Not that it's boring, but other people have done it and done
Yeah.
it really well, and I wasn't sure I had anything fresh or different or interesting to bring to that kind of a story, but with a slightly different bent, with a sort of alternate New York. There was something there, and that's why it kept
Right.
nagging at me, I thought. But as you said, it is really about humanity. That's what the story's actually about. And
Yeah.
all my stories have got something. They're always saying something else. And I think, given the last few years that we've been through, the pandemic and everything, this was probably the story that came out of it. I think it's been there
Hmm.
in the back of my brain for a while.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So really just looking at, like how humans react in, like you said, a stripped away setting where they're not reliant on our technology, but you still kind of put them in this setting that is really unique. Was there a moment or was there something where this setting really came alive for you, where you really inspired to put it into the setting that it's in?
I think it's the towers in New York, in this other New York. When I started
Mm.
thinking about it, it's one of these things where sometimes I'm writing. I plan all my novels, but there are gaps on purpose. and I just write, and in the moment I create something, and sometimes I don't know what it is, and I'll leave it in, and it'll grow and develop into something. And other times I look back in the editing process and go, no, that needs to come out. It doesn't make any sense. But it's not a spoiler because it's on the front cover of the book. There are these giant birds that aren't quite vultures. They're something else. And that was kind of scratching at the back of my brain. And the fact that there's 2 moons on the cover. And then suddenly thought, why there? And I just left it in. And then that steamrolled into the city and the fact that there are skyscrapers in this New York, but not what people think. And it started weaving between all these pieces together to create this setting. Right. And once I'd put them in place, I then started thinking, well, why? And then my brain starts building the backstory for all of these things. So sometimes I do that. I just kind of put breadcrumbs down, and then I have to go back and think about why they're there, or if they don't make any sense, take them out.
Yeah, it's, I always find it incredible how our brains will do that. They put in these little breadcrumbs into a story, and then when you kind of get to the wherever you're getting to in the novel, and how to what degree of a planner you are, you kind of figure out later, oh, this is why that piece connected to this dot here. And my brain kind of knew what it was doing.
Our subconscious brains are a lot smarter than our conscious brains.
Sometimes
just trust me, me. Oh, okay, sure, yeah. I'll just leave it in there.
Yeah, so you've said a couple of times that you are a heavy planner of your stories. Now, do you give yourself enough room to kind of let those things play out as you're actually drafting?
Yeah, so I always know the beginning, the middle, and the end, and I have milestones. And I tend to break the story into 3 or 4 parts, depending on what is required. And I'll sort of heavily plan the first bit, and I know where 2 and 3 are going, and 4. And I'll write that bit, and then I'll move to the next section and more heavily plan that bit. I find if I do the whole thing in one, so I know Peter Brett does like 22, 26 bullets per chapter, and he'll do the whole book front to back, and that could be like 50,000 words. Yeah. So there's probably some gaps between the bullet points, but I find if I do that, it ties me in too tightly, and I kind of sometimes move and the story flexes. So by writing it in chunks, I don't feel like, I can't, there's no kind of creative jumps and sparks sometimes where the best ideas come from. So I have a rough skeleton that I work to, but I build up as I go. And I find that kind of works for me over the years. That I perfected my process, and that's what works.
Yeah, and that makes sense. So you're not, writing into the dark, kind of the destination, but you kind of are a little bit more malleable on how you get there.
Yeah. I enjoy that kind of flexibility of it.
Yeah, I definitely am not a heavy planner at all. I try to outline, I do my best, and I kind of get enough to get to where I'm going a bit, but I have to have I end up going way off track of what my outline is doing anyway. So,
but you find that by planning, you don't have to do as much rewriting after the first draft.
You know what? Yes and no. Like, my brain just doesn't. I get to a certain part of my outlining process, and my brain refuses to go further because it doesn't know the characters yet. So I have to do a little bit of exploring of the characters and kind of figure out their motivations a little bit and who they are before I can kind of finish the second half of the outlining process. So I kind of do things in weird stages.
If it works for you, this is it. I always say, whatever works for you is the right way to do it. It's just if you can't finish the book, and some people are like, it's not working if I always do this. And I'm like, well, change the process. Whatever you thought, it's not clearly working. Go back and do something different,
Yeah, exactly.
To get to the end of that first draft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so so with this being kind of a different genre for you, was there anything different in your process of how you put the story together?
I didn't do as big a world Bible as I would normally do. I tend to kind of gather bits and pieces over several years in the background on a new project whilst I'm doing the existing project. I find that less distracting. I never write more than one book at once, but you always get that idea screaming at the back of your mind going, write me instead, this is much better. And it's like, God, I've come to realize the trap of that. But the way for me to kind of get away from that is I start making notes on it, and I write all the things down and blast them into a Word document, just fill it up with loads of stuff.
Yeah.
With this one, because I knew it was going to be something a little bit different, I didn't put as much down. So originally I thought this was going to be a novel. And once I'd finished the first draft and came back and looked at it, I was thinking, right, can I turn it into a novel? And it was only through trial and error that I realized, no, it is what it is. It's 42,000 words. It doesn't need to be any longer. I don't need to try and make it a pure crime novel or a pure fantasy novel. It's just this weird blend of different things. So I didn't do as much planning and research. I just sort of did some. And if I got to something where I got stuck, I mean, because it is a different kind of story, I didn't need to do as much research into some things. So it was quite more freeing than what my usual process was. So that was probably the biggest difference.
Yeah, because and we'll talk about some of your other books a bit yet, but your other books that you're publishing currently, it's more of a historical fantasy. So I imagine that contains a lot more research.
A lot of research by comparison, yes.
Yeah,
huge amounts.
So was this, and I don't know what the timeline was of when you were writing which piece of that series. So like, was this really kind of a palate cleanser for Judas Blossom and that series?
I think there was some overlap. But it was, I think it was before I got into the first full draft of Judas. There may have been some kind of stuff in the background, but it was just a very different kind of thing to what I've been doing for the last decade at this point. Yeah. But it felt quite refreshing because it was new, really, for me.
Yeah, so steering back a little bit into kind of your publishing journey a little bit. The publishing, you've alluded to a bit, the publishing landscape has changed over the last decade. So from when you first, I guess from your perspective, having been within the trad pub industry, because I'm not, I'm self-published and I talk to mostly self-published authors. Yeah. What from your perspective has changed in the publishing landscape since you published your first book?
So when I started, there was no self-publishing really. There was Vanity Press, which was you send your book to a company, they will print it and send it back. That was the only thing they would do. And then you'd be hand selling books at events. That was it. Yeah. Right around that time, self-publishing was starting up and ebooks there was no e-readers. It was starting to become a thing. So people like Bengali and Rob J. Hayes were literally working with Amazon and they were working out what the hell to do at that time. But in the last 10 years, it has dramatically changed. The landscape has, come on so much that self-publishing. There are some books on my bookshelf behind me that are completely imperceptible. You wouldn't be able to tell which are self-published and which are traditionally published. The dangers of self-publishing is that some people think, therefore, they don't have to put as much effort or work or money into it. And so there's a lot of, absolute dross that is self-published. They just bang it out there and it's absolutely awful. But there's some amazing stuff out there by comparison. And it's totally changed. So traditional publishers, because they are a business at the end of the day, this is one of the things I think some traditional published authors struggle with, because everything we do is based upon creativity. We're making up these fantastic stories, but you are making a product to sell at the end of the day. Right. And the publishers are a business, so they need to buy things that they know they can sell. And the markets change and moods change. And if they're, putting out 20 crime books a year and then the following year they're just not selling, they might only put out 10 crime books a year. And so, romantasy is the big thing that's in now that came from external or self-publishing spaces. So that's kind of the next big thing. But with self-publishing, the market changed where if the traditional publishers weren't buying a thing, it didn't mean that readers didn't want it. It meant that some readers that they were selling to weren't as interested in it, or their numbers were coming down. They weren't making as much money. Yeah. And people are saying, oh, well, they don't know what they're doing. Some people will say, but at the end of the day, some of these publishers have been in business for a long time. So they're right more often than they're wrong. But when they are wrong, there's still usually a market for some of these genres. If you write something that's so weird, that's so out there, that's so bizarre, there will be a market in the self-publishing space, but it'll be very small. But they're just so, they might not be buying a lot of really hardcore, traditional, epic fantasy right now in the traditional space. But there are a ton of people who still want to read it. And the self-publishing market has filled that void. And you have some very, very popular, very successful authors, who are friends of mine, like we mentioned, Ryan Cahill, Philip C. Quantrell, Michael R. Miller, Fletcher, Rob J. Hayes and Bengali. All of these are doing more traditional, some of their books, not all of them, more traditional kind of epic style fantasy.
Yeah.
And the readers are there.
Mm-hmm.
But when the traditional publishers have tried to sell them with new names, it hasn't always worked. So you've got your Brandon Sandersons, you've got your John Gwynns, you've got your Anthony Ryans, and their books are all awesome, and people will just buy it. Or, you know, Joe Abercrombie, because it's the next Joe Abercrombie book. They don't go, well, what's the book about? Nah, I'm not interested in that. It's like, what's the next Abercrombie book? That's the difference, I think. And you do get new people coming into the market with something slightly different in the traditional space, like, let's see, Justice of Kings. Richard
Swan. Yeah.
Loved it. Loved the first book, loved the second book, but it's quite different. It's not your traditional boy goes on a quest with a sword and begins up being a great hero. It's like a roving justice who's also got like powers, and there's like kind of Cthulhu mythology mixed in there. That's a bit weird. That's a bit different. So it's a totally different landscape these days. It's a case of if you take a novel and you finish it and you take it to traditional space, and they don't buy it, but the quality is good, it might be there's still a market for it. And if you have the time, the money, the skills, and the effort and the patience, then you can self-publish it and still get a readership and get it out there. But it requires a lot more of a business brain than the traditional space. You still have to be very cognizant, and you have to be very aware of how business works, which I think some traditionally published authors aren't. They don't have that business background. My university degree that I did is in business studies. So for 20 years I've been doing marketing for my day job. So I've had that business brain and the creative brain, and I think some people don't have that aspect.
Right. Yeah, I think, you know, I mean, a few things I would like to touch on there. But to that point, you know, I think that there's also so much that you have to know going into whether it's self-publishing or traditionally publishing.
Yes.
There's so much that you don't realize that you don't know. Right.
Yes.
You, we haven't even mentioned, like, you've actually written a book on publishing, on getting into the traditional publishing space. So I mean, that's a landscape that's foreign to me. But even with self-publishing, I mean, when I started writing my first book, and this was 5 years ago, I was like you, I didn't know self-publishing was an option, because I had grown up that, you know, self-publishing means you're printing 10,000 books and keeping them in your garage and hoping that you can offload them somewhere. So, you know, but the amount that I've learned in that time about self-publishing is overwhelming. So I feel like, you know, if authors are just taking a look at how much they don't know, then it is overwhelming, and it's, you know, hard to kind of realize that you might be writing because you're passionate about writing, but if you want to sell your books and have a career as an author, then you have to also be a business as well, right?
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of myths about traditional publishing and self-publishing, and that's another reason I started doing my YouTube channel, is that I hate a lot of the myths that have come up around traditional publishing, and I regularly debunk a lot of them. And some of them come from companies trying to push people into self-publishing, but they charge them for it as a service. And so they spread lies and complete falsehoods. The latest one, which was only a few weeks ago, was that in order to be traditionally published, you need a million followers on social media.
What?
That's the latest one. And I just like, hang on, this isn't like 5 years ago, 2 years ago. This is weeks ago. Someone has put this on their YouTube channel, and look, they're a self-publishing service, and they can help you get their book out. You just have to pay them lots of money to do it.
Yeah, of course.
Right. Sure. So I hate kind of stuff like that. And it's another reason I've got like lots of videos debunking stuff.
So what are some of the common myths that you've heard, other than, you know, some of the latest ones, because that seems pretty outrageous to me, actually. But people obviously buy it.
I don't know anyone who's got a million. None.
No, like, maybe Brandon Sanderson has.
Stephen King now, but when he started, you know, anyway. The biggest myths about traditional publishing are you have no control over the process of your book, that your book will be turned into something else, that not the story that you've written. That's a lie. They'll cut you out the process and you won't know what's going on. You do at every stage. You know what's going on at every single level. Every editorial note that you're given, you can say no to them if you want. It's a suggestion. Everything. People are like, no, you have to do what your editor says. No, you don't. Everything they tell you is a suggestion. If you ignore the ones that make sense, then that's on you when everyone points out the huge plot holes when the book
Right.
comes out. But
Right.
you know, so there's a lot of them that come out. I mean,
Yeah.
I try to be as impartial as I can because there are negatives to the traditional space, and I've been in it for 10 years, and there are negatives to the self-publishing space. But it's being fair that I haven't seen enough of, which is why people like myself, Alexa Dunn, Michelle Schusterman are traditionally published authors on YouTube doing videos about both sides of really.
Yeah, and I think that, you're right, that is a perspective that you don't hear, or that we don't hear as authors as much, because there aren't as many people trying to sell traditionally published courses and that sort of thing, because there's a process, an outline process for that. Whereas there is a lot of really shady courses and programs and all sorts of things trying to take advantage of people trying to pursue their, this dream of becoming an author, that, people are willing to sink money into it. And there's definitely people trying to take advantage of that, right?
Yeah, and it really upsets me. It denigrates a lot of the hard work. Like, it took me over a decade and many, many books to get traditionally published, and I didn't know anybody in the industry. I didn't have any friends and contacts and all that kind of thing. That's another thing they say, you have to know someone. No, you don't. You just get pulled off the slush pile. It's all about the work. It's still about the work. So,
right, yeah, and there are pros and cons to each path, right? Because there are definitely cons to traditional publishing. You can't, you might not get that book out. You might have to, and yet, you might not ever get picked up and that sort of thing, right? So they're definitely legitimate concerns, but there's no need to really overhype and over demonize those cons that aren't there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I got picked up after many, many books, but the first book that I went to with my agent was then published. There are other authors that I know that now have books out, some of them with the same agent as me, that their first book with that agent and the second book did not go anywhere. So Andrea Stewart, Bone Shard Daughter, and a new series, new trilogy is coming out. Yeah, I think it's her third novel that was the one that was actually the Bone Shard Daughter. She has the same agent as me. And the first book, our agent picked her up, said it's great. They went out to the market with it, and it just didn't work for whatever reasons, timing, or the second book didn't work, and it was the third book. So she's got over the huge, massive hurdle that so many people struggle with in the traditional space, which is getting an agent, someone who believes you, a cheerleader who's going to back you all the way, and she did, but the market at that time said no. So
I actually have Andrea's coming on the show next month.
So so she'll tell you about that.
Yeah,
definitely. That it was her third book. Yeah,
interesting. Yeah, looking forward to hearing about that. But I'm interested now. Then, 10 years later, if you were starting your writing and publishing journey today, what would you do differently, and what approach would you be looking at doing today in today's market?
I would think very carefully about what I wanted to do with the books. Typically, with the traditional publishing space, if you're in the fantasy and sci-fi market, slightly different in some other genres. One book a year is kind of the norm. Usually you start with a trilogy, not always. Sometimes you start with standalones. It depends upon the publisher. But once you're kind of into that process, you have to regularly produce work. And the idea is, you produce a body of work and you build up that back catalogue.
Right.
You don't have to have certain skills to do it, but even as a traditionally published author now, there's some things that you're expected to do more than you ever had to before. Like social media is not a requirement. It's not necessary, but I think it's a useful tool. Whereas if you were going down the self-published space, you have to be aware that you have to be a business manager, and that requires a lot more time. And if you have a full-time job that takes up a lot of time, or a family that takes up a lot of time, you have to take that into consideration, but also the cost, because you're paying for everything. That's the other biggest change. Self-publishing is slow. Yes, it is. Absolutely. But I never pay for anything. I've never put my hand in my pocket and given money to my agent or my editor or the publisher. It never works that way. The money flows to you. Whereas as the self-published publisher of my own enterprise, my own business, I have to pay for everything. So do you have the resources to do it? Do you have the time? And do you have the drive to, once that first book is out, you've got to put another one out fairly soon. That's not to say within 3 months or 6 months.
Yeah.
but you can't put one book out and then 5 years later put another book out. It just, you won't be, you still have to have momentum. So momentum in either side is something to think about. The other thing is, think about what you're writing, the genre. If it's so weird and it's so different and it crosses so many borders, there's this very small possibility it will be traditionally published. Whereas in the self-publishing space, you'll find an audience, but there again, it might not be what you think it's going to be. So it's setting expectations, I think. You have to be cognizant and business-minded as much as a creative person.
Yeah.
Probably more so in the self-publishing space.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, and I would say too, even, if you have such a niche book that, there's nothing comparable to it, I think you're going to have a tough time making a go of it, self-publishing that as well. You'll get, you'll have it published. You'll have a book published that you'll be able to say is published. But if you're looking to make a, career off of that, I think that is not going to be an upward battle. It might not be impossible, but I feel like that could be a harder struggle for you as well, right?
And it's the same in the traditional space. Like everyone talks about comp titles in your query letter, and that's where you point at what your book is similar to, so that they know roughly what they think it will sell at, on what level, and therefore, based upon all that, they can calculate the advance that they give you for the book. There again, it's back to their business knowledge of they get it right more often than not wrong because they're still in business. If you say my book is like Brandon Sanderson meets Brian McClellan, they'd be like, oh, okay, right. We know roughly where you sit in the market, who the fans are, what they're reading. Whereas if you say like 6 different things and they haven't heard of 4 of them, they'll be like, I don't know how to sell this.
Yeah, right.
It could start the new charge of something and create your own brand new wave. But those are 1 in a million. Those are absolutely 1 in a million pot shots.
And it's rare that a big publisher is going to take a look at that and be willing to take that risk on an unknown, right?
Yeah. They might, but the advance would be a lot smaller. Really, probably like you might get a smaller publisher that'll say, "We'll take a chance on you, but we can't offer you much for this." And then that's that thing of, do you want someone to manage the process and get it out there and just have the book out there, or do you want to kind of do it yourself and see if you can make a go of it? So
So now, was that kind of your consideration when you were taking a look at New York Minute? Just circling back to that decision there, you were taking a look at the kind of what the comparables might be and realized that there wasn't really a marketable avenue for a publisher.
Because it's not a straight crime novel, it's not really a fantasy novel. It's more speculative than anything else. It does have a lot of the tropes of being a kind of noir story and a PI story, but because it is a bit weird, it'll appeal to my readers, but only up to a certain level, but it'll appeal to crime readers, but only up to a certain level. So it's a weird cross-genre thing. So it's possible that if I'd gone to some of the smaller publishers, my agent, they may have taken a chance on it, but it was just a weird thing. And where I am now, I was more interested in seeing for myself about the process, because in the future, I do want to self-publish other novels, full-length novels, and this is quite a good kind of trial run for me to learn the process, go through it a few times, so that when I eventually get to do a novel, I have more experience about how it all works, and I'm not doing it cold on my first full novel.
Right, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So I mean, you mentioned it there, but so you do plan on continuing a hybrid model of both traditional and self-publishing.
Yes, I want to do at least 2 more stories with these characters, probably 2 novellas again, I think. I start writing the second one in January 2025, actually. So I'm saying that because depending when this comes out, but in a few months, I'll start working on writing the second novella. The plan is for it to come out next year. There again, I'm not saying when, because I don't know how long it's going to take me to write it, edit it, but I'm planning it to come out next year. But I've also still got books on contract in the traditional space too. So
I mean, we're getting close to an hour, but let's take if you want to take just a quick minute and just let us know a little bit about the other books you have published, in case our listeners aren't familiar with your TradPub works.
Yeah, so my debut came out in 2015, which is kind of hard to believe now. I got my agent in 2013. That's the first time I spoke to her. So so I've had 2 epic fantasy trilogies published by Orbit Books and a prequel novella as an ebook. Those are very kind of more traditional, with wizards and loud magic and epic battles. The first trilogy is quite different. The first book is very much a war book. The second book is more of a crime book. And the third one is more like a post-apocalyptic horror novel, but they're all fantasy. And then I did a sequel trilogy. After that, I did The Quest for Heroes duology, The Coward and the Warrior. And those are modern interpretations of Quest novels, the kind of the rough structure, but I wanted to do something new with them and bring something different to them and talk about a number of very specific things. There again, what had been going on in the news and in my head, and over the last few years when I wrote them, those books came out of there. My current series, this is the one that took a lot of research because it's historical fantasy. So it's a trilogy that's set in 13th century Persia. And I say it's historical fantasy because it's accurate up to a certain point in terms of historical events, but then I've introduced a number of things that aren't historically accurate. Some of the characters are based upon real people. Some of them are based upon fictional people. There's a little bit of magic creeping in around the corners, but it's very much Earth in the 13th century when the Mongol Empire was this enormous kind of sweeping galactic force that was taking over the entire world. And the story is about a group of rebels fighting back from the inside, trying to tear it apart whilst they're trying to grow it and kind of cover the whole world in this one kind of nation, essentially.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I've actually been listening to Judas Blossom, and I've been really loving it so far. So, I was going to say, we could have a whole nother conversation around that, and maybe we'll need to, maybe when the third book is about to come out. But I was going to say earlier, you're no stranger to jumping around in genres and subgenres. Like it's not like you've chosen epic fantasy to be what you're going to write, and that's all that you're writing.
Yes, I like doing different things. Yeah.
Yeah, which is great. I think as writers, we like to kind of explore different ideas and different story ideas. And I know some authors will stick to kind of one lane, and their readers like that, and they'll read everything they ever write. But some of us, I think, are a little bit more scattered in our what we enjoy, and so we want to write in different genres as well, right? So.
Yeah, I like to stretch myself. I like to do different things. I like to play around with things. And so I've done, fantasy. I've done a sci-fi novel that, that needs work and things in the background. And I've got other ideas for other things. But it's all going to be within the speculative space, I think, for me. Right. I don't think I'll ever just do a straight crime novel.
Right.
Yeah, there'll always be something a bit weird in the books.
Yeah, I'm with you there too. Sci-fi or fantasy or some sort of speculative, angle to it. But I wouldn't be able to venture too far away from that.
Yeah, I enjoy it too much. So yeah,
exactly right. Yeah, you've got to enjoy what you're writing.
Definitely, yeah,
for sure,
absolutely.
So Stephen, this is the greatest podcast in the multiverse. So can you tell me how, in a parallel universe, a different decision might have shaped another version of your life?
So when I was much younger, in my 20s, I thought about becoming a teacher.
Oh, really? Okay.
So I may, in another life, I might have actually been a school teacher, perhaps teaching creative writing, I would think.
Oh, really? Yeah.
At some point. Yeah. Which, weirdly, full circle now, I've now started mentoring other writers. So I think I'm kind of exploring that in the current universe, which is quite fair. It's interesting. But yeah, I enjoy it. I really enjoy it. So yeah, maybe I would be a school teacher in another life.
Was there a certain event or something that, shifted you away from that decision?
Not really. I think I had really good teachers at school. Some of them really inspired me, and I loved English and I loved writing, and I kind of thought about it. And then I ended up on a different kind of degree course. And so I just, it seemed to work, and it seemed quite well and seemed to enjoy it. And so I kind of did that instead. So ended up in business.
as one does after having a passion for writing, right?
yeah you got to have a day job to begin with. You can't just jump in both feet.
Exactly. Cool. Well, Stephen, thank you so much for joining me today. Can you just let our listeners know where the best place to find you is?
Yeah, sure. My website has all information on all my books, stephen-aryan.com. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. I've got a monthly newsletter which you can sign up for, which has updates on all the projects and various events that's coming up in the next sort of year, in the next 12 months or so. So those are the best places to find me.
Really cool. I'll be sure to link all of those in the show notes. Thank you once again for joining me. This has been a lot of fun.
My pleasure. Thank you, Aryan.